Hello, John, and everybody. Welcome to the webinar. And I know John is back there somewhere. Here he comes. Welcome,
Sorry,
everyone, to
I had
our
a
our webinar today. We're celebrating the California Preservation Awards, and I'm coming to you from Los Angeles. Welcome, John and Samantha. John, you want to update everybody on how we run these webinars?
Yes, this is the second part of a four-part series, and our Design Awards is the capstone, the online Design Awards celebration, which is next Thursday. So we encourage you to join us next Thursday. We also have another part on next Tuesday. So please join us next week for the programs. Today's program will look at two cities and two approaches, one in San Francisco, one in South Pasadena. Both very different approaches, but addressing very important needs in our communities now. So first, we're going to start with Samantha Rose, who will look at the San Francisco Resiliency Planning document for the Embarcadero. And then we'll talk with Evan St. Charles from ARG, who will talk about the South Pasadena ADU guidelines. I like to remind people how to ask questions, and please do. We want to encourage you to ask those questions using the Q&A box today. Other than that, we'll keep an eye out in the chat box and on the participant list for any raised hands. If you would like to raise your hand and ask a question of our panel in person, you can do so. With that being said, we should have questions in about 30 minutes or so, and we're going to turn it right over to Samantha Rose here to talk about the San Francisco Resiliency Planning document.
Yeah,
Welcome, Samantha.
Thank you so much. All right, I will share my screen. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Samantha Rose. I'm an associate at TEF Design in San Francisco, and we've been working with the Port of San Francisco on their Waterfront Resilience Program. And we authored a report for this program that focused on the historic assets and the risks and hazards associated with those assets within the Embarcadero Historic District. So that's kind of what I will be talking about and sort of framing today. So the Waterfront Resilience Program, or WRP, is a program that was made to address seismic and flooding hazards across 7.5 miles of port land along the San Francisco waterfront. And ultimately, this program really seeks to, not just protect the immediate waterfront, but also downtown San Francisco, the South of Market area, which are both vulnerable to liquefaction in an earthquake and also flooding due to sea level rise. So I want to mention that, TEF's work is part of a much larger consultant team. This is led by Jacobs Engineering. It includes engineers, environmental scientists, urban designers, and architects. And the port is also working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on these studies as well. So to give you some context for the program, it has three main areas: the Embarcadero, Mission Creek, and then Islias Creek and the Bayview. The Embarcadero Seawall program, which is actually now called Embarcadero Resilience, if you go on their website, was the first area of study that was undertaken. It was done as part of the multi-hazard risk assessment, which was completed again to assess those hazards and risks across that 3-mile stretch. Our work with them began in 2016, and this report, the MHRA, lots of acronyms here, really included structural, civil, environmental, urban design, and historic evaluations. So all kind of coming together to create a basis for future adaptation strategies. So the area that we are working on and that I'm talking about today is really defined by the seawall. So I just wanted to go through, what is a seawall? For San Francisco, it's a rock and concrete embankment. It runs along the waterfront and really defines the edge of our city in that area. It was built between 1878 and 1915. It is all unengineered fill. So again, looking at it seismically, we really want to kind of focus and be able to protect it. And it's very interconnected with the wharves and the piers that you see along the shoreline today. So the seawall was really created as a boundary for the infill of the bay and the soft marsh areas, basically what's now the financial district and again, SoMa south of Market. And that allowed for the berthing of ships in deep water. You can see in the map, the kind of inner jagged red line, that's what the shoreline used to look like back in the 1800s. And that outer red line that is much more rectilinear and organized, that was that's what the waterfront looks like today as created by the seawall. So this is just a historic section from the seawall, just to give you a sense of kind of what that typical section through the waterfront looks like. We have that earth embankment on the kind of right side of the screen. That would be downtown or SOMA. And then on the left side of the screen is the bulkhead structures and pier structures that have the typical bulkhead wharf buildings and piers over water. And you'll actually see as we go later that the areas of liquefaction and the areas of flooding are very much, pretty much exactly tied to the areas of fill that were created that again were kind of infilled beyond the seawall. So what is at risk here? We have a lot of elements running along the waterfront, not just historic assets that I wanted to touch on. So we have a lot of infrastructure that deals with life safety and disaster response. There are a lot of utilities, transportation corridors, and then of course all the buildings and folks that go along, run along this area, drive along this area every day. So these are some great renderings from our colleagues at CMG, Landscape Architects, that really kind of focus on, what could happen in a seismic event, what could happen in an earthquake. So we can see that, utilities could rupture. We have areas of liquefaction of that movement. And then, of course, we have building failures and structural failures that could happen, again, given, that future event. We also have issues created by flooding. So we actually have flooding along the Embarcadero today from king tides, but in excuse me, going forward, the Embarcadero roadway, which is a major transportation corridor, and again an important part of disaster and life safety response, could flood. And then the BART and Muni tunnel, which actually kind of exits very close to the waterfront, is also at risk as you get increasing levels of sea level rise. We, of course, have a lot of wonderful urban design already along the waterfront. And so CMG and SiteLab are focused on looking at the risks and the opportunities for future development of the kind of urban environment. And then, of course, we have the historic assets. So all of those historic buildings and structures that run along the waterfront today. There are about 60 assets that we, TEF, looked at for our historic assets and risk report. That includes assets within the area of the Embarcadero Historic District. And so, this is a National Register district. It encompasses the area from Pier 45, which is Fisherman's Wharf, so kind of to the right of the screen here, and it goes all the way to China Basin and Pier 48. I will note that Pier 48 was actually outside of the study of the Seawall program, but it is part of that National Historic District. The reason that this district is important, I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, but it is actually the last largely intact break bulk port in the United States. And it was really a driver of economic and city and really kind of regional growth during its period of significance in the 19th and early 20th century. It was listed in 2006 rather. And there are a number of factors that kind of create its importance as a district. We have the leadership of the State Board of Harbor Commissioners, and again, their role in really developing San Francisco and that kind of radiating out into most of California. The idea of a driver of commerce from all of the various kind of transportation that was running through here, as well as all the cargo that again use this as a kind of starting point for distribution across the state. There are important labor events associated with this district. The Pacific Coast Maritime Strike of 1934, also known as the Big Strike, which really had national implications on labor policy. And then Harry Bridges, who was one of the leaders of this strike, is an important historic figure associated with the district. And then finally, as kind of physical, we have the engineering, which we see in the seawall, the bulkhead wharves, and the pier structures. And then the architectural and urban planning aspects of this district represented by the City Beautiful movement and really just sort of the changes that this district spurred in the urban design of San Francisco. So really our goal for the Historic Assets and Risks Report, which you see on the right side of the screen here, was to take existing historic catalogs, of course, like the National Register nomination form and other kind of developments that have happened since, and really catalog the buildings, document their significance and their uses and conditions today, and create a sort of record of, again, what is there, and then what is at risk due to seismic and flooding hazards. And it is worth noting that even though the district was landmarked in 2006, today the district is not the same. There were some piers and structures that have been removed due to deterioration. There are also some major renovations. For example, if you're local, the Exploratorium moving in to Pier 15. And so we really wanted to create a kind of updated snapshot of what does the district look like and feel like today. So to give you a sense of kind of what is there now in terms of buildings, one of our asset types, we have a typical kind of typology along the waterfront that you'll see, which is a bulkhead building, which is supported by a bulkhead wharf below, and then a pier shed, which is supported by the pier structure over water. And the bulkhead buildings were really built as part of that City Beautiful movement, starting in kind of the early 20th century. And they were typically used for offices, passenger services, more sort of front facing, again, to kind of beautify the waterfront. Whereas the pier sheds behind were used for cargo, storage, distribution, and an offloading as things kind of came in and out of the port. So you can see down below here, again, that's that typical sort of section. We have this very short little bulkhead building, and then the very long pier for all of that kind of cargo support beyond. Wanted to show just kind of one of the typical spreads from our report. And so here we have, this is an example from Pier 1, and really just wanting to catalog, again, what does the building look like today? What is its historic status as a contributor to the district? Construction dates, a brief physical description, talking about the architectural style, the historic use, as well as the current use. And then we also want to touch on access, how much of the waterfront is accessible to the public versus accessible to businesses or maritime uses and sort of other functions. Also looking at a list of selected modifications, just kind of what's happened to these buildings over time since their historic period. And then, of course, a summary of the character defining features. What are the things that are going to be important to maintain and support as adaptation strategies are considered in the future. And then finally, just additional kind of significant events or features. For example, this building is not only a contributor to the district, but it's also an individual landmark in the National Register and part of a grouping of buildings with piers 1 through 5. And so then in addition to buildings, which we, are the most visible kind of, assets along the waterfront, we also have these major engineering projects. So the seawall itself, which was done in a series of segments, but is considered one kind of continuous resource contributor to the district. And we also have the bulkhead wharves, which run parallel to the seawall and again helped create those deep water berthing zones. And you can just see, these are historic photos. The San Francisco Public Library has such an amazing collection of historic photos. So if you want to know more about what the port and the piers looked like back in the day, I encourage you to look at their image archives. You can see the level of engineering, of rebar, of just, sheer construction that went into creating our waterfront. And then finally, we have the historic piers. So that's both again, the building above the pier shed, but it's also the piers themselves. And you can see all of the piles that went, through the water into the bay mud. And then on the right here, that's one of the pile drivers that was actually, physically taking those huge pieces of wood or concrete and driving them down into the bay. So after we did this whole catalog, we looked to our engineers and this kind of technical support on the MHRA team to help us to understand, where is the risk within this district? Again, if we did nothing, which we're not going to do, but what would happen if just nothing was done? And so in terms of seismic risk, what we really see is that the areas of Young Bay mud have the highest areas for liquefaction and highest risk in an earthquake. So that includes the kind of more central area of the Embarcadero Historic District. That's where the ferry building is, the ag building, piers 1 through 5. So again, some really significant resources in these areas that are over that Young Bay mud. We see actually less hazards in the southern waterfront, which is the left side of the screen here. Again, because that Young Bay mud is just less deep, and so there's less areas for that movement and liquefaction. And then along the northern waterfront, there are also some high hazards here due to that kind of the sand. And so that includes, of course, both the historic assets, but also the other assets, Pier 39 and kind of other areas along the waterfront. So then in terms of sea level rise, there were basically 3 levels of sea level rise that we considered in this study. 1 foot of sea level rise, which is anticipated between 2035 and 2055. And that is, you can see here really kind of focused on the lowest lying areas of the Embarcadero district. So again, that ferry building zone, highly vulnerable, and even vulnerable to that today. You'll see when there are king tides, there are areas of the Embarcadero that flood. Um, and then as you kind of go further on in the century from 2050 to 2070, looking at potentially 2 feet of sea level rise and the impacts, again, along that sort of central span of the district. And then you can see into downtown. And this is actually where you start to see that area is essentially the line of the old bay. And so the water, there was a lecture that I went to where someone said water has a memory and it kind of wants to go back to where it was before. And so you'll start to see that starts to happen where the water is kind of going back into the places where it was that soft marshland or previously just the bay. And then finally, with 3 feet of sea level rise, which is expected toward the end of the century, we really have, most of the district, again, if nothing is done, most of the district flooding, again, looking at sort of going back essentially to that old coastline with the area of water intrusion. So ultimately, the report, which again consisted of a lot more than just our study, had these overall findings of up to $30 billion of damage if nothing is done. Looking at areas with low risk of lateral spreading and liquefaction in the southern waterfront, but then areas of higher risk and liquefaction in that sort of central area, which is also at risk for sea level rise. And then in terms of the historic assets, it really was the bulkhead wharves and therefore the bulkhead buildings that were at the greatest risk for an earthquake and a seismic event. So next steps. There is obviously a lot of love and investment in the waterfront. Places like the ferry building and the exploratorium and areas that have already been renovated and already have that investment. And then there's other areas of the waterfront that have yet to be invested in and are more of those kind of maritime uses or storage uses. And so how do we kind of look forward? How do we balance that investment of these different types of resources, of their different uses, and kind of look forward into the century with regard to seismic and sea level rise? So we basically have a very long stretch for this study and this program as it moves forward. So we've wrapped up this sort of due diligence phase, at least for the Embarcadero area, and now we're looking at some early projects. So what can we do in the very short term that will improve mainly life safety and disaster response? So it's less focused on some of the historic assets, but really looking tactically at what is going to improve if something happens in the short term. And then as we move forward, looking at adaptation strategies that are kind of longer term. And so thinking about, different combinations of adaptation strategies that would involve defending against floodwaters. So kind of, keeping those floodwaters out, accommodating floodwaters, how do we let them in and adapt buildings and infrastructure in place? And then an amount of kind of retreat, how do we protect the current shoreline either by moving buildings and infrastructure inland, or in some cases actually out into the bay in order to get a wider zone for adaptation and for raising of a shoreline, for example. And it's very exciting because they just, actually, I think yesterday, released the draft adaptation strategies. I'll have a link at the end of the presentation. So you can learn a lot more about what is happening with these strategies and the kind of various measures that go into thinking about how to adapt the waterfront for the future. But I did want to touch on historic strategies because that is, part of kind of the plan going forward. And so thinking about, what do we look to? How do we kind of think about adapting these buildings? Of course, we have the Secretary Standards. There's also some great kind of newer guidance from NPS about adapting for flooding. And so really looking to these documents and then kind of in some ways for flooding, extrapolating that out to a district scale. This guidance is really focused on buildings, but how do we think about it from the entire district scale? And so just kind of going through, these are some of the kind of things in our toolbox as we identify projects, as we move forward, as they are involving historic resources, how do we think about them? We think about planning and assessment, which is part of the reason why we did the report that we did. We think about temporary protective measures as that sort of stopgap. This was a study that was done for the piers and thinking about temporary flood proofing for these structures. We think about site and landscape improvements, again, working with our urban design partners and our landscape partners. How do we kind of invest and think about, modifying the shoreline around these buildings while still being very sensitive to, of course, their historic setting and their integrity. We also think about protecting utilities. We see a lot of solar already on the roofs of these buildings, but moving things so that as waters rise, we don't run into issues with building systems. And then finally, again, looking at that idea of, the kind of retreat, although it's not entirely retreat, but thinking about elevating buildings, thinking about moving historic buildings, saving those resources with a more kind of intensive and engineering effort. So thank you so much. Again, if you want to learn more about the Waterfront Resilience Program and all of its many, many amazing aspects, you can go to the Port's website. It's down below here. You can also just search Port of San Francisco WRP. And then again, if you want to do a deep dive into some of these initial adaptation strategies that are being proposed, you can find those on the Port's website as well. So thank you so much. I am now going to stop sharing, if I can figure out how. All right, I'm having a little bit, there we go, thank you. And I'll turn it over to Evan.
Thank you, Samantha. And I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see.
Great, looks good.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Evan St. Charles, and I am a senior associate with Architectural Resources Group. I was the project manager of the South Pasadena ADU design guidelines for historic properties, which ARG prepared in 2021 and which I will be presenting on today. In order to understand the impetus for the creation of the design guidelines, it's helpful to have a little bit of background. So South Pasadena's ADUs ordinance was updated in 2019 for compliance with state law, specifically Senate Bills 13 and Assembly Bills 68 and 881. I'm not going to spend too much time going into detail on the bills and by no means an expert on state ADU law. However, there are a few key takeaways to understand. The new laws require that local governments allow ADUs on all residential properties, regardless of their historic status. They also require that local governments provide a process for ADU projects to be approved ministerially. This means that ADUs must be approved over the planning counter without any discretionary review from a historic review board or historic commission. And building off the second key takeaway, any standards that municipalities put in place for ADU design must be objective. Despite the 2019 update to the city's ADU ordinance, the city received interest from homeowners asking for additional clarifications on the requirements and a more streamlined approval process. One of the items that needed clarification was how the ADUs ordinance applied to South Pasadena's historic properties. In January 2021, ARG was contracted to develop the design standards and guidelines specifically for ADUs on historic properties and in historic districts. The design standards were incorporated into the amended ADUs ordinance. And in conjunction with the design standards, ARG prepared a design guidelines handbook that would supplement the standards and through easily digestible illustrations and graphics. The standards and guidelines were approved by City Council in December 2021. And just to note that while the information that I'll be presenting today applies to both the standards and the guidelines, I'm mostly focusing on the Design Guidelines Handbook today. The purpose of the design guidelines is to retain the integrity of South Pasadena's historic built environment by providing guidance on constructing historically compatible ADUs on historic residential properties. Another objective is to support the overarching state preservation plan goal of protecting historic cultural resources by maximizing compatibility between ADUs and existing historic residences. The design guidelines are based on the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties and are intended to complement the design standards found in the ADUs ordinance. Before I dive into the contents of the guidelines, I want to first provide a couple of definitions so you know what I mean when I say ADU or JADU. So an ADU is an accessory dwelling unit. It's a residential unit added on an existing residential lot. It is generally subordinate to the main residence, and it is independent from the main residence with its own kitchen, bathroom, and utilities. A JADU, or junior accessory dwelling unit, is a residential unit built entirely within the existing footprint and square footage of the historic or the primary residence. It has its own entrance, but may share a bathroom or other systems such as air conditioning with the main house. The design guidelines apply to all ADU projects in South Pasadena that are listed in South Pasadena's Inventory of Cultural Resources. This includes individual historic properties that are designated or have been determined eligible for listing at the federal, state, or local level, as well as contributing properties in historic districts that are designated or have been determined eligible for federal, state, or local designation. Non-contributing buildings in historic districts are not subject to the design standards and guidelines. Additionally, ADUs that are not visible from the public right-of-way are exempt from the standards and guidelines. As shown on this slide, visibility from the right-of-way means visibility of the ADU from the street immediately in front of and within 10 feet on either side of any street adjacent property line. New vegetation, gates, fencing, and any other landscaping elements may not be used to screen an otherwise visible ADU for the purposes of determining visibility. When applying for an ADU project, an owner is required to provide a site plan showing the proposed location of the ADU so that city staff can determine whether or not the building would be considered visible. Now that I've established which properties are subject to the design standards and guidelines, I'll spend the rest of the presentation discussing the various parameters described within the guidelines handbook and shown in the red box on this slide. Under the design guidelines, ADUs may be located at the rear of the property behind the primary dwelling, within an existing accessory structure like a garage, or within an existing primary residence as a JADU. It is important to note that ADUs that are attached to the primary dwelling are not allowed under the design standards for historic properties in the ADUs ordinance. City staff and the South Pasadena Cultural Heritage Commission decided that attached ADUs should rather be processed as an addition to a historic building rather than as an ADU to allow for a discretionary review process as required under the city's Cultural Heritage Ordinance. While ADUs are allowed up to 1,200 square feet on a historic property as required by state law, the size and scale of the historic primary dwelling should be considered when deciding how large the ADU will be. For example, a 1,200 square foot ADU is not recommended if the primary dwelling is the same square footage or less. The ADU should be subordinate to the primary residence. And just a quick note, all of the illustrations that you see are taken directly from the design guidelines handbook. So, they're meant to be very clear and graphic, but then supplemented by text. The height of the ADU cannot exceed the height of the primary dwelling with the following exception. Even if the dwelling is less than 16 feet in height, the ADU is permitted to have a maximum of 16 feet. So if the dwelling is 15 feet, the ADU can still be 16 feet under state law. Two-story ADUs are permitted up to 12 feet in height as long as the ADU is subordinate to the height of the primary dwelling. Two-story ADUs are only permitted when the primary dwelling is also 2 stories in height, with one exception. If the historic property is on a hillside lot and contains a 1-story dwelling, as shown at the bottom of this slide, a 2-story ADU is permitted if the ADU is located downslope so that it looks less in height than the primary dwelling as seen from the front of the property or the public right-of-way. Under the design standards and guidelines, ADUs generally must be designed as a simplified stylistic variation of the primary dwelling, meaning the ADU must be constructed of similar materials and retain similar architectural features as that of the historic residence. If the ADU is attached to an existing accessory structure, such as a garage, architectural features and materials may be similar to the accessory structure rather than the primary dwelling. While it is arguably this is arguably a conservative approach or a quote unquote traditional interpretation of compatible design, or what is considered compatible, ARG and the city felt that it was the most effective method of being able to provide objective requirements that could be approved ministerially by planning staff. It is also important to note that if the owner wished to create an ADU design that did not meet the design standards, they would be able to go through a discretionary review process, which the Cultural Heritage Commission would have the chance to review and approve or deny the proposed design. The design of the roof type, whether it is flat, gable, hipped, etc., must match the primary dwelling or the existing accessory structure. The roof pitch must be similar to or within a certain range of the existing residence or structure. The ADU's roof materials should match the primary dwelling or structure with a few exceptions. Composition shingle roofing is an acceptable alternative to wood. Set cement tiles are an acceptable alternative to clay tile, and solar shingles are an appropriate alternative to wood or composition. The city and the Cultural Heritage Commission felt that vinyl tiles should never be allowed, so they're prohibited under the standards and guidelines. The design of the ADU's wall cladding must substantially match the primary dwelling or the existing accessory structure. The cladding must also be differentiated from the residence or structure through color, profile, width, and/or texture. For example, if the primary residence is clad in a red brick, the ADU must also be clad in masonry, but in maybe a lighter color, such as a blonde colored brick or with a different bond pattern. If the primary residence is clad in stucco, the ADU would also be clad in stucco, but differentiated through the use of a different stucco texture or color. Windows on the ADU must have the same orientation, either horizontal or vertical, as the primary window type on the existing residence or accessory structure. Windows and doors must be made of the same or similar materials as the historic residence or structure's fenestration. For example, wood-clad windows or doors are acceptable if the primary dwelling's windows are made of wood. Vinyl windows, again, are prohibited under the design standards and guidelines. If an accessory structure is being converted into an ADU, existing garage doors on the structure may be replaced or infilled, provided that the original framed opening is preserved. For example, as shown on this slide, the existing garage doors are proposed to be replaced on this garage with new French doors within the original framed opening of the garage door. As mentioned, an ADU must reflect a simplified stylistic variation of the existing historic property. To that end, the guidelines provide information on the basic design elements of the common architectural styles found in South Pasadena and listed on this slide. Thus, if an owner plans to add an ADU to the primary residence and their primary house is craftsman in style, the owner would refer to the craftsman section within the design guidelines handbook for information on appropriate materials and architectural features that they would use to design their ADU. Concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Evan. I'm going to also ask Samantha to turn her video on and we can do some Q&A. Do you want to start first, John?
Yeah, I see a few questions here in the Q&A box. Let me transition here.
I got you on the spot, John.
Thanks. I was switching over our view for Facebook and YouTube. Anyways, the question actually I'll ask first is from Dylan, and the question is: have any district contributors undergone HAB's hair documentation, or are there plans or recommendations to do so prior to future alterations? This is for the San Francisco project.
Yeah, so I believe there was definitely some HABs and hair work that was started in the 1970s and beyond. I don't know of any work that's planned for future projects right now. I think mostly that's because those projects haven't necessarily been identified yet. But I would imagine that, yes, that type of documentation would be done, kind of on a project by project basis, depending on the condition of the resource and then, its level of integrity. But we're still at the kind of really early stages right now. So nothing in the works that I know about.
Thank you. I'm working on a laptop, so everything's blocked with screens, but okay, I have a question from Emma. And were any seismic protections put in place around the Embarcadero after the Loma Prieta earthquake?
So in terms of the buildings, yes, there have been a number of seismic upgrades to some of the port buildings along the waterfront since the 1989 earthquake. But again, it's been on a kind of project by project basis. And of course, following the Secretary's standards for those seismic rehabilitations for historic buildings. I don't know about the Embarcadero itself. There was the Embarcadero freeway that was taken down in 1991. I'm not sure what the work was done on that area. It's actually technically outside of the historic district, so I'm not an expert on that. But yes, there's definitely been seismic work. But this kind of initiative, the Waterfront Resilience Program, is really kind of the first to take that holistic approach to the entire Embarcadero, to all of the kind of historic district, looking at it both seismically and from a flood aspect. So this is kind of the time that we're now looking at it again from that kind of bigger picture lens rather than project by project.
Great. I was just going to mention, I was watching the streets of San Francisco the other day, and you can see them driving down that Embarcadero freeway. And it's still really hard to imagine that that structure used to exist there, because now that street is so activated between Market Street and the Ferry Building. It's hard to believe that there was ever anything else there. We don't have any other questions in the Q&A at the moment, but oh, here comes one. But I was going to say, I'm going to ask one right now. If you have any questions, go ahead and post them in the Q&A. And I'd also, after this question, I want to talk about materials on these ADUs. But first, Evan, here's a question from Terry. Has there been any pushback to the prohibition on attached ADUs and considering them as additions to enable discretionary review?
So not to my knowledge. I actually checked in with city staff yesterday about kind of how the handbook and the guidelines, as well as the design standards, have been received. And from what she could tell, they have been pretty well received by the public. So I don't know of any pushback.
Should I ask a question?
I'll just go ahead and ask it. John has too many things happening over there. So as a follow-up to that, yeah. I know, as a follow-up to that, how might an ADU proposed at a residence with an architectural style that's not covered in the guidelines be handled objectively?
That's a great question. The styles that are included are intended to be comprehensive of South Pasadena's historic architectural styles, but I think in that instance, it might be up to the planning staff at the counter to determine, based off of the appearance of the original residence of the primary house, to go off of whatever architectural style is most similar. But at the same time, with there are, specific features to each style, but the bulk of the guidebook is mostly about form and massing and roof pitch and materials, and those can all be determined regardless of the architectural style of the house.
And you had mentioned vinyl. Was that for the exterior? You said vinyl was not going to be permitted. Is that exterior, like vinyl siding?
Yes, so vinyl siding, vinyl windows, but if they were wood-clad vinyl, that would be acceptable. So it's any exterior vinyl would be prohibited under the guidelines and standards.
Mm-hmm. And is this even if you can't see the ADU from the street?
So if you can't see the ADU from the street, and it meets that that description of that kind of very specific description of visibility from the public right of way, then they wouldn't be subject to those standards. So they could, design using vinyl or a different architectural style than the house.
Okay, I can't tell if I'm freezing or not. John, did you have a question to ask?
Yeah, no, my question is for Evan, actually. What we often see in our city is people are getting creative with how they build these ADUs because they know that there's so many limitations, and people are starting to go both underground and on the second stories of garages, for example. And I don't recall you ever really talking about sort of those sort of situations where people want to add square footage to a garage that's existing, for example, by either in some cases going underground, even into the basement of the main house itself. What were the guidelines for the ADUs for your document on that?
So the ADU, the guidelines and standards provide kind of recommendations for adding on to an existing historic an accessory structure like a garage, and that's whether it's a garage conversion, a conversion and an addition. So you could potentially add above the garage. I believe you would still have to maintain the height requirements that are described in the ADU's handbook. Basically, that the height of the building, the ADU, whether it's a garage addition or a new ADU, would have to be lower than the height of the primary residence. So, but it is a possibility under the standards to add on to an existing garage. And the same, I'm not sure, I'm not familiar enough with the general ADUs code about adding on via, going underground. So I can't speak to whether or not that would be allowed under the city's current code.
Okay, I see John has another window open. Let's see, can you provide a link to the ADU guidelines for download as a PDF?
Sure, yes, and it is available on the city's website, so I'm happy to.
Okay. If you just want to post that in the chat and then people can access it. Okay. Yes, and we got another question about that in the chat, so go ahead and post that. So if we're looking at the future of these two cities, one of the ways that we were promoting this webinar was like two cities, two different approaches to these critical questions that are facing our urban areas. What do you see? I'll start with you, Samantha. What do you see as sort of how your study contributes further, even how your study contributes to, like, say, San Francisco in the year 2070 or something like that?
Yeah, I think for us, it's really about, what is the character of the waterfront in 50 to 100 years? What does that look like? How does the waterfront adapt and change, not only kind of based on around the historic resources, but really from a much larger standpoint of urban design and, business and equality and equity and all of those factors, because it is such a public space within the city. It's really kind of this amazing corridor that is totally free, that you can just walk down pretty much continuously for 3 miles. And so that attracts tourists and locals. And so, I think it's really just about what is the future of this space and how does it become resilient while also really maintaining and creating more public amenity space for the city and for the region.
I agree. I think there's I'm in Los Angeles right now, my hometown, and I spend a lot of time in Pasadena and San Francisco. And I was thinking about this in a more, existential level, the future of the cities and how much change is going to happen to our environments. When I was raised here in Southern California in the 60s and the 70s, a lot of that I can actually see it disappearing. But it doesn't accommodate what we need for, the people, for equity, for housing, for people today. And I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on historic preservation guidelines and standards as we go forward. And I'm dealing with the same thing as an owner of a historic house. I was talking to Samantha about this earlier. How do you steward your building into that next generation when you're now faced with other things like insurance coverage and how to keep that mortgage going. But Evan, I'd like to ask you the same question. Pasadena is such a beautiful historic environment and so many important buildings are there. So how do you see your work going forward in maybe the next 50 years? How do you see that setting the stage for that in Pasadena?
Sure. So just to clarify, this is the city of South Pass, which is
South Pasadena. I'm so sorry. I know that's historic. I'm so sorry. Yes, the city of South Pasadena.
Yes. Yeah, which is easily confused. They're right next to each other. But so, when we had been approached by the city in designing or developing the design guidelines and the standards, I think the city and most cities in Southern California and the entire state really recognizes that we're in a major housing crisis, and California will likely continue to draw new residents. And so the guidelines are really meant to provide for that much needed housing in cities like South Pasadena that have a very rich history and an extensive collection of historic properties, but that still allow for new development. So this is kind of providing that flexibility needed to create new housing for future residents while also maintaining that historic fabric and character that makes cities like South Pasadena so unique.
And it's going to be a real challenge. And following up on that, are there enforcement mechanisms for ensuring compliance with the ADU guidelines? It's a question in our chat.
Yeah, so much of what I described, the design parameters that are in the guidelines handbook are echoed in the design standards that are in the ADU's ordinance. So they are required by the city's law. They're in the code for the overall the overarching ADU's ordinance related to historic properties.
Great, thank you for explaining that. Sorry, John and I are trying to figure out some tech difficulties here.
Well, Cindy Heitzman, our executive director, wanted to join for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. So I was figuring that out, and she's on right now. So I'm going to turn it over to her.
Oh, great. Welcome, Cindy.
Hi. Hey, John, you need to read your memos. I said, why? This is why I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
I don't see it.
Yeah. Anyway, the reason I wanted to join is only when this program is nearing its end to really make an announcement. And it is that this is Chris Madrid-French's last webinar with us. She is taking a new job with San Francisco Heritage, and we couldn't be happier for her. It's a growth experience for her, and we have grown so much since she's been here. And I wanted to publicly announce this, extend our gratitude to her, and to let everyone know that she's not leaving. She'll be just literally down the street from us. And so we'll still be in touch and we'll still be working together. But Chris, I want to let everyone know how you have enriched our programs and how you have really touched this organization.
Oh, thanks, Cindy. I'm sad. I am definitely sad. And it's been so much fun to be with you and John and have such fun people like Evan and Samantha on these webinars. And I know that one of my fans out there, Nelson. So I will get in touch with you. I will literally be down the street in San Francisco, and we are going to be working together. I'm the new director of advocacy and programs with San Francisco Heritage, and we're going to be partnering with CPF on the upcoming upcoming conference in April. So we'll be doing a lot of work together, but thank you, Cindy. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
John, is there another question? I thought I saw a question come in the Q&A. Barbara, I think, said something in there. I know, how do we recover from that?
Barbara is asking, I don't know how to go to a question from that, but Barbara is asking, are there fees for the South Pasadena ADUs?
So I believe there's kind of a processing fee, but that wasn't within ARG's scope, since that was part of the kind of overarching ADUs ordinance. So it can be found in the ordinance, but I'm unaware of what specifically the fees are.
Great. I just wanted to thank our speakers today, and I want to give a personal thank you to Christine French, who has been a wonderful colleague all these years. And even though we've only sort of met in person twice or 3 times.
I think twice. I think it's been, it's very funny.
It's been a wonderful experience, and she's going to be in San Francisco still. So I really look forward to working with her more on the conference committee here coming up for Fort Mason. So she's going to be a part of the conference. She's going to be a part of CPF. And we really thank her for all of her time and effort and everything. So to our speakers,
thank you, John.
Thank you for these wonderful, beautiful projects. And they really address some important issues that the reason one of these projects was recognized for a Trustees Award was because of the very pressing issues that they address. So I just wanted to thank our speakers again. And a reminder that we have Tuesday and Thursday of next week, we have 2 programs. We hope you'll join us. And tonight, or Thursday night, time is running away with me here. Thursday night, we have a program in Pasadena. Cindy, do you have anything to close out with?
No, just tune in to the rest of our programs. And I hope everyone will join us next Thursday, the 27th, for the online presentation of the California Preservation Awards, recognizing 17 projects across the state, including the 2 that were presented today, and also honoring or presenting our President's Award for Lifetime Achievement to Dr. Barbara Lamprecht. So we encourage everyone to join, where you'll get a little deeper dive into each one